Hello, everyone. I'm glad to see you guys again for our last Bible study. I feel like I do need to apologize with how long the last video ended up being, and of course, the video before that. It just seems like as we get closer to the end of Advent, we get more and more details about what's happening in these days. So I'm going to try to keep today's a little bit more simplified, even though it's still just as amazing and very eventful for a Friday. So to help recap, we started with Sunday with seeing God's blessings and signs in action, letting us know that God is present in our midst of celebration and seasons of change, and even times of coming losses. In spite of that, we know that God is always with us, providing us and preparing us for the journeys that we take ahead of in our faith journey in life. On Monday, we got to learn about, of course, blessings and curses, with example of the fig tree and the temple, and the cleansing of the temple to be exact. On Tuesday, we learned about the lessons that Jesus taught and the questions that he was asked and had asked during that time. Wednesday, we looked at, of course, Judas' side of the story and what may have provoked him and what he can teach us when it comes to how we might struggle with our own faith journey, because he was one of the 12, so he clearly was struggling. Thursday, we of course looked at the Maundy Thursday events between the garden and the Last Supper, to see again where God might be leading the disciples, how God is preparing Jesus, and preparing, of course, the rest of us by seeing signs, by wondering what happened and why. Our days are filled with much wonder, such as how Jesus prayed. That was also a big question, because we learned that it's possible, especially in the Gospel of John, that Jesus prayed 3 different prayers, not just for himself, but also for us. Not only back then, but even today. Today we're going to be looking at Friday, which of course, if you know how Holy Week story unfolds, is a time when Jesus is arrested, he gets questioned, and inevitably gets sent to die on the cross. But before we get into all of that, let's go ahead and recap how the virtual Bible study works, even though you've probably heard this plenty of times from me, and you're more than welcome to skip. For those of you who know how Bible studies usually work, often in an in-person Bible study, you would have a group of people that you can talk to, peers and fellow brothers and sisters of faith, who you can share stories with of your own experiences in life journey, to reflect on how they might have a different point of view in order to help enrich your experience as you address the text that is presented. However, sometimes when it comes to virtual Bible studies, we may or may not be able to have that same opportunity. If you're able to be with friends, family, and watching this video together, then I hope that you take the time to go ahead and continue to ask those questions and reflect on what you're reading, what you're hearing, and what stands out to you as you explore faith and what God might be telling you through God's words together. Sometimes you might be watching this home alone, and if you are, then you're more than welcome to reflect on these lessons on your own, to probably be able to use a different version of the Bible than the ones that I'm reading from, which today will be the NIV version. And you can always reflect through writing, through creative means, if you prefer sketching or drawing, to see where God might be leading you, what God might be showing you, and what may be moving you through these texts, through these lessons that you may have not noticed before. And of course, if you don't feel comfortable with writing or reflecting in that way, if you don't have people to talk to and reflect with, you can always go to the Lord with prayer. You can read over the text on your own time, reflect and pray over what you're hearing with God, what God might be reminding you of, and what you might have seen in the past that might connect to where you are now and what you're hearing today. Perhaps God might be enlightening you in different ways when we take the time to breathe, create space to let God be God in our midst, and allow him space to speak into our lives. Now that we've finished this recap of how virtual Bible study may work, knowing that there is no limitations when it comes to creativity and the ways that we can come before our Lord with faith. Let's go ahead and look at today's lesson. So when it comes to Holy Week's Friday, we do know the story. Often we hear that it starts off with Peter denying, because of course, by the croak of day, Jesus already prophesied on Thursday that Peter will deny Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows on Friday. The interesting thing about that prophetic message is that 3 plays an amazing number of times in what happens on Friday. And you might be wondering why or how. But there's a lot of things that do happen. Like we know, Peter denies Jesus 3 times, which means Peter's been asked 3 times if he really was one of Jesus's disciples. And does he need to be sharing in the same sentence or judgment as Jesus is during that time? And of course, Peter, wanting to preserve himself, says, "No, I don't know the man." And it sets an interesting stage, because in John's gospel, Peter's denial is the only time separated into different parts, that it wasn't all at one time, like in the other gospel readings. Because if you looked at Matthew's version of Peter's denial, in Mark's gospel of Peter's denial, or in Luke's gospel of Peter's denial, Peter does deny Jesus 3 times. But the way that it's presented is that it's all together, all simultaneous, during this time that they are just trying to stay safe, trying to find warmth while waiting to see what happens to Jesus. But in John's gospel, they separate Peter's denial into 2 parts. After Jesus is arrested, it's known that Peter, along with one other disciple, followed Jesus, maybe for a distance, because we knew from the other text on Thursday that they scattered. And even though it was said that one person, one soul did follow Jesus, it was never told that it was a disciple exactly. Yet here we are hearing about Peter's denial, and we know that he follows Jesus with one other disciple, and they are going to wait outside the high priest residence to wait to see how the verdict goes. During that time, one of the high priest servants talks to Peter and asks Peter if he is a disciple of Jesus, to which Peter denies, wanting to hide himself, keep himself safe, so that he doesn't have to worry about sharing the same fate that Jesus is going to be going through. And then we go from, in this section of John, which is John 18, starting at 15, if you want to look for yourselves at the text. We then see Jesus being questioned by the high priest. And here's how it goes, starting at John chapter 18, starting at verse 19. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teachings. "I have spoken openly to the world," Jesus replied. "I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews came to gather. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who hear me. Surely they know what I say." When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearby slapped him on the face. "This is the way you answer the high priest?" he demanded. "If I said something wrong," Jesus replied, "testify as to what is wrong. If I spoke the truth, why do you strike me?" We see that Jesus is being honest in his answering to the high priest. He's explaining that he has brought everything that he's been teaching into light, that what he intends to speak is purely truth, even though it's just as frightening time as Peter. Where Peter is hiding, Jesus is testifying, not for the sake of preserving Jesus' own life, but for showing God's truth in the midst of what was a chaotic situation. Again, we hear about Peter denying Jesus with verse 25 in John 18, chapter 18. And then it goes into both of those questions at the exact same time. And then, of course, the rooster crows. And right after, you'll see Jesus being brought before Pilate, now being questioned about his authority. And even there, Pilate asked Jesus 3 questions. Again, that role of 3 comes into play again. 3 denials, being questioned now by Pilate 3 times. One being, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. And what is truth? At least in the Gospel of John, these are the questions that were asked to Jesus. Pondering, what is the significance of why Jesus was being punished? What is his true testimony? In what way is he inciting the people, like the leaders, the Jewish leaders, are testifying that Jesus has been doing and deserves to be punished for? And then again, we have 3 powers of authority. We have the high priest questioning and challenging Jesus to find some reason to condemn him, and couldn't. They went to Pilate then to ask if he can find any truth to condemn Jesus, because they don't want, of course, the problem to lay on their hands if it can go to the ruling body to be punished for. Ergo, the Roman Empire, and Pilate, specifically or unintentionally. And Pilate, after questioning Jesus 3 times, couldn't find a reason to condemn him. And then there was actually one other person that we know of, in terms of the ruling powers that ends up being questioned, is that if and when Pilate learns where Jesus originated from, that he is under Herod's jurisdiction. And that's what I'm trying to find right now, is where does Herod come into this? Oh boy. I think it might be in Luke's gospel that he finds out. Yep. That Pilate finds out that he's in part of Herod's care and jurisdiction, so he sends Jesus to be questioned by Herod to see if there's any true grounds for his crucifixion. And even being questioned by Herod, which we don't go into the details, although Herod was more than happy, according to the text. And this is Luke 23, if you want to look, that we go into seeing how Herod addresses Jesus. He ends up sending Jesus back to Pilate, robed in purple and with a crown on his head, mocking him, dressing him ridiculously in elegant robes, sending him back to Pilate. And from that day, we hear that Pilate and Herod became friends because they have been enemies. Before, they had been enemies, because their agreement that there was nothing wrong with Jesus had brought them together to find a common ground. So 3 times, Jesus has been, of course, challenged, trying to find the grounds in which he may be crucified. And the 3 powers truly couldn't find him. 1/3 wanted a reason to crucify Jesus, where Herod and Pilate, 2/3, weren't able to find truth and didn't want to hide or deny the truth. So when Jesus comes back to Pilate, Pilate then brings him before the people and says that he will, of course, punish Jesus and then set him free, only to then be told by the people, crucify him. And this stumps Pilate. Again, the role of 3 comes into play, because Pilate tries to ask the people, what has Jesus done? There's nothing that would prevent him from being released. 3 times he argues to set Jesus free. And the 3rd time, according to the gospel, I want to say of Luke, that he became very concerned with the crowd, very worried about how they were responding, because he knew that they wanted Jesus gone. So he ends up talking to Jesus one more time, asking about his kingdom, asking about his authority, and learning that even though Pilate's in a position where he can choose to free or crucify Jesus, Jesus reminds Pilate that his authority is limited, because any authority that it was given to him was given to him initially by God, and that things are playing out the way that maybe God is intending them to, taking Jesus down a road that may not be desirable, that does lead to a lot of pain, heartache, and suffering, which Pilate does not want to be responsible for. In fact, one of the texts even says that he says that his hands are clean of this man's death, and he hands them over to the crowd to be crucified. So you see how many times the number 3 comes into play? Peter denies Christ 3 times. Jesus being questioned by 3 powers, often being told questions in threes, even by the head priest, and trying to be freed 3 times, only for the crowd to say crucify 3 times. After being given over to be crucified, and according to this, it was probably around noon after all these testimonies have been going on, Jesus is given the cross to carry. And he goes to a hill that's called a place of skulls. Sorry, the translation's a little rough, at least in the text that I'm reading from. And of course, there again we see a pattern of 3. The 3 crosses. Jesus has been is going to be crucified between 2 criminals. During that time, they prepare him for death. They make it a sign to mock him. They gamble off his lots of clothes. The crowd mocks him. 1. The high priest still mock him, saying, if he's truly the Son of God, surely he could ask and save himself. He saves many lives, why not himself? And then one of the 3 that we are told in the stories, of the one beside him, a criminal, also taunts Jesus. 3 times of taunting. And those 3 times of being torn down, of being questioned, of being provoked to be able to do something to save himself in the midst of the chaos that he finds himself in, Jesus chooses to stay, for the most part, silent and only speaks when it's necessary. Comforting Mary, his disciples, and of course speaking the famous final words that you may hear in many other Lenten studies around this time of year, and to see the significance of what those words carry, which I will not go into today. But you are more than free to do your own studies, to do your own research, and to see the significance of those words. But if you stop and think about those 3 crosses, again, it parallels the powers at play. With the head priests wanting to find a reason to bring Jesus down, so too did one of the thieves want to take Jesus down, knowing that they all were going to die, but if he could be saved, he wanted it. The other one, of course, rebukes that thief, reminding him that they deserved their punishment. Again, 2/3. Both of them know that they did something wrong, and Jesus didn't do anything to provoke this outcome. Instead, he asked Jesus to simply be remembered when he goes into his kingdom, knowing that he did falter, that he wasn't always honest, and meeting his end, he would like to repent before his God. Jesus acknowledges that one thief, and assured him that he will join him in the kingdom. 2/3. Where we see faith at play, that the light is being shined. And that's another thing that you can see this testimony about, is that often when truth is hiding in darkness, the truth is going to come to light. That its ripple effects may not be entirely stopped, but it can be seen. And God's glory can be seen. Even when it came to the end, we still get testimonies of how people choose faith, even on that awful day. As much as we do see many people, it looks like, asking for Jesus to die. Before I wrap things up, there's one more particular passage that I want to bring to your attention when it comes to the Gospel of John. As you may have known, again with the symbols of threes at play, a particular character comes into the narrative, especially after the time that Jesus is crucified. It's when the request for the burial. In the Gospel of, in many of, if not all four of the Gospels, affirm that a particular man, rich man in many, as being described, asked Pilate for Jesus' body to be buried in his tomb. It's referred to that this man's name is Joseph of Arimathea. It's a name that I cannot pronounce. Some people have speculated whether this particular rich man was the rich man that Jesus looked at, who wanted to know how to gain eternal life and couldn't give up everything to follow Jesus. Despite keeping the 10 Commandments, he couldn't follow. Because it's known that Joseph, in this case, was a disciple of Jesus, who had been, to a degree, keeping track of Jesus' teachings. So when he found out that Jesus died, he of course asked Pilate for Jesus' body so that it can be buried in his tomb, creating space for Jesus, which kind of parallels the fact that when Jesus was born, there was no room in the end. Yet when he dies, space is made. Likewise, Nicodemus, even though I know Joseph doesn't show that sign of 3, but Nicodemus was also mentioned to help Joseph, with preparing Jesus' body for burial. Now, Nicodemus in John's Gospel appears 3 times. The first time being at night to question Jesus when it comes to acknowledging worldly things and a worldly view, that this is what the Pharisees believe, that Jesus can't possibly be able to do God's work because he works in times and days that contradict their understanding of the law. Jesus heals on the Sabbath, which seems to go against what they believe. And after talking to Jesus, he begins to see that Jesus can't work beyond separating himself from God's self, and it makes him question who then God is. second time that it's mentioned in John's Gospel that Nicodemus actually, during the time that Holy Week began, talks with his fellow Pharisees, questioning them if Jesus has truly done anything wrong. He was the only Pharisee that actually stood up for Jesus, wondering what really is his crime. What really has he done to piss people off? How has he truly been breaking the law if we can see the signs that God is working miracles through him, healing people, helping restore relationships, able to perform magnificent feats that go beyond understanding, yet the rest of the Pharisees didn't want to see or acknowledge. He chose to question their faith by trying to seek God's truth. And then now we hear how Nicodemus puts his faith to action by showing his respects to Jesus and Jesus' teachings, by working with John to help prepare Jesus' body for burial, so that it may be put in the tomb and waited until after the Sabbath to be anointed. At least that's the plan. Again, a meander with threes. One with doubt, one with challenging our worldly views to taking actions and showing love, respect, and faith, to honor the one who had created us. Friday is full of sadness and sorrows. Jesus goes to the cross for us. And in that same time, we see God's light of love in action. The light of truth in threes. That sometimes it's hard for us to acknowledge the truth that surrounds us. Sometimes we want to hide ourselves, much like Peter does. And yet God still chooses to redeem us. I will not be talking about the Resurrection Sunday, because that is the start of the new week and not really a part of Holy Week. So this is going to be the final lesson for Holy Week. And before we wrap up, I do have some questions to help us reflect on this narrative of Friday, of this Good Friday. During this Friday, we see that Jesus has gone through many trials and tribulations, has traveled many distances, going to places that he himself would likely not choose to go. Again, given the cup that he would rather not drink from if he had his choice, but did because God was leading him to. So do you think that God might send us in our daily lives to events or places that we might not see ourselves going to? When have you ever experienced a time like that? Or maybe you may not be feeling energetic, but you still feel like you have to go somewhere. Maybe because it's a family obligation, like going to visit your grandparents or your parents, even though it feels like a crazy time and you don't really feel like you have time to spare, but you haven't seen them in a long time, so you feel like you need to make that space and time. Or maybe, well, like I said, that's an example, and I'm sure that you guys have your own examples of times that you've been to places you don't want to go to. Maybe you have to go for a conference at work and it's so far away and you have to travel by plane and you don't like air travel. That would be a situation where you feel like God might be calling you or sending you to something that you don't feel comfortable with, or in a way you don't feel comfortable with. And what might you have gained from that? What has that experience either taught you? Maybe it affirms that you don't like traveling that way, or maybe you might encounter some conversation that you hadn't had, or you might learn that maybe air travel isn't so bad. There's many different ways in which you can probably see that kind of situation. And it's also written that I believe Jesus told his disciples this, that when you were young, you could go freely wherever you wanted to go, but as you get older, someone else will tie your belt and take you to paths that you do not choose for yourself. I think that we see that when it comes to this particular day in Holy Week. So when has it probably felt like that this statement might be true? When in your childhood would you say that you felt like you had freedom to just be a kid? And when may have you experienced a time that it didn't feel as freeing to be a kid? And what do you feel like that restrictions may have been? And why? And of course, as you get older, would you still believe that that's true? That maybe as you're looking forward to retirement, do you really feel free? Or do you still feel like you have obligations, that you have other commitments? Or maybe as you continue to get older, how does working with your family, working with those who are providing care for you, how does that make you feel like you're back to being a kid again? Where do you still find your freedom? And where do you still feel like you're being guided? Maybe in paths, again, you don't feel like you have so much say. Or even in your middle ages, you have those questions about where life's going. I'll leave that to you, to wherever you guys are in your faith journey today. And in those midst of those times that might feel aggravating, where you're going someplace that you don't want to go, where do you see God working? Have you had anything that sparks a presence, or maybe a sign that God might be giving you a moment to learn something new, to see something new, or to see God in a different way? How does God both encourage you and challenge you in the midst of these times? That's all my questions for this evening and this day, and I pray that you all have a wonderful Holy Week, which will be starting tomorrow with Palm Sunday. So I hope you all are blessed, that you all are well, and that this Easter season will fill you with wonder, joy, and celebration. Thanks be to God. Bye.